You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things Sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and Sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top Sidemount divers. Whether you're new to Sidemount, been Sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things Sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet.
Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. This episode is brought to you with the support of XDEEP and the patrons of Speaking Sidemount. Thanks so much to both for assisting to make everything you're about to listen to possible. Now, over the past 2 years through Speaking Sidemount, I've been exploring the many benefits and positive aspects of Sidemount diving. In fact, right from episode 1 where I spoke of the 7 reasons you should dive Sidemount, I've been covering, with the support of many of the best Sidemount divers in the world, aspects such as equipment flexibility, streamlining, stability, redundancy, access to valves and regulators, and so on. We've then also gone into how to dive in every possible environment, from the overheads of caves to shipwrecks to open water, both from shore and from boats. But there's no free lunch. With all of the flexibility comes options. There are so many different ways or styles of Sidemount diving, and as the equipment is fitted to your body, literally everyone's final setup is going to be somewhat unique. So the challenge for all new Sidemount divers is, how do you learn all of the detail required to get your setup right? Well, as we've said time after time, step 1 is find yourself a good instructor, one who specializes in Sidemount. If they don't dive it all the time, at a minimum they dive it regularly and can demonstrate a high skill level through their own diving and through their students. Another point to consider is to ensure that the Sidemount style or configuration, if you like, is suited to the diving that you're going to be doing. Diving steels in a dry suit is different to aluminium or aluminum in a wetsuit. No doubt you can cross over, as I do often, but it takes time to learn the nuances of each configuration. Head on over to the Sidemount Pros website for a bit more on this under how to choose your instructor. Now, even if you get a great course and bet in your initial configuration and skills, there's no doubt that you'll be looking to optimize and build on this over time. There will always be little improvements and adjustments you can make to your setup. The question now is, where do you find the information to support this? Years ago, you did it on your own, as I definitely did. Sometimes you'll be lucky and be able to dive with a group of Sidemount divers and share knowledge and tips. There are many of these groups around the world, including Sidemount Sundays in Adelaide, Australia. Now, the internet can be a mixed bag, but I've recently acquired a copy of Rob Neto's book, Sidemount Diving, The Almost Comprehensive Guide. And no doubt, I wish I had a copy of this years ago. It literally is the most complete written guide to Sidemount diving out there. First released, I think, in 2015, Rob has just released the second edition, and it's 300 pages of great information on everything from Sidemount configurations, Sidemount systems, how to choose what works best for you, and the skills necessary to dive Sidemount. What I really liked about it was there is plenty in there on how to set up various parts of your system and when and why you might favor a particular choice. There's also great imagery from renowned cave photographer Laurent Moreau. So it was great to have the opportunity to get Rob on the show and discuss his diving, how he got into Sidemount and cave diving, and then cave instruction, to delve into his motivation for writing the book, and then we dig into a bunch of different topics around setup and skills, and then Rob shares on his exploration projects in Cozumel. Look out in the podcast notes for a discount code to get a copy of Rob's book, Sidemount Diving, The Almost Comprehensive Guide. And don't forget, this show does not make itself. Especially if you're a regular listener, I would sincerely appreciate your support by becoming a patron of the show. Support levels amount to only a few dollars a month, but our patrons make a massive difference in supporting this production.
We are recording. Rob, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, look, it's great to have you on. I've known of you for absolute years as one of the premier Sidemount divers in Florida, certainly, if not the world. And it's taken me a while to get around to chatting to you, but I'm really pleased we've been able to catch up. And one of the things that encouraged me to, this my dog's got a squeaky toy, would you believe? I'll leave that in there. Whatever happens, happens. He's got to occupy himself. So your book's just come out, and I really do want to get into that because it's just one of the best books in Sidemount diving that I've read, and I've read a few So I definitely want to get into that. But let's go right back to the beginning. How did you get into diving?
It was something I had been interested in for a while. And after I got married to my wife back in 2003, we both had the interest. And believe it or not, we came across, this was pre-Groupon, but it was one of those coupon books for 2-for-1 type of deal. And
Yeah.
jump right into that. We did research it a little bit, and the shop that was offering it was the better of the two shops, the two dive centers that were in our area. So we said, let's go ahead and do this, and took our first class and got certified, and it just took off from there.
Mm-hmm. It's quite funny doing something on Groupon is probably both of us would put our hand up right now and say, hey, don't do that.
Exactly.
Then here you are, you started out with one of those deals. And I think when you start out, you quite often you don't know any better, do you? And you just go out for whatever's a good deal. And we think all instructors are built the same. And of course, they're not. But how did you go on from that? So you started with an open water course. And then how did that progress into you getting into sidemount diving and cave diving?
Well, cave diving came first. We were in Arizona when we got certified. And about a year later, we planned our first trip to Florida, not really for the springs or anything. We came out to Florida just to do some wreck diving, warm water, ocean diving.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as probably happens 50% of the time, we got blown off of our open ocean dives. And so we said, hey, let's go to the springs. Went to the springs and did a few of the open water friendly cavern dives, and decided, the cavern training will be really good for our diving. So let's go ahead and schedule that. And we came back 6 months later and did that. Never had an intention of going full on cave diving. I was more into wrecks. My wife had seen one of West Skyle's Dipolder 2 photos in National Geographic a few years before that. And she's like, I want to go there. And I thought, that's way beyond what we could ever do. Brand new open water diver, didn't know anything about it. Well, after the cavern class, I was hooked. Cave diving was it. And over the next few trips, we continued our training in the overhead environment. And about a year later, we decided to just pick up and move to Florida because I just couldn't be that far from the caves anymore.
It's amazing. So what grabbed you? I mean, was it the skills or was it the environment or some combination?
What brought me to cavern training was the skills that I could acquire from having that level of training. It's not really anything that you can find anywhere else in diving. The open water specialties and all that, they try to emulate some of that, but with overhead cavern training, you really need that. And yes, there are instructors out there that do offer these skills, but it's difficult to find who those instructors are. And with cavern training, you kind of know if it's from a reputable instructor that you're going to get that training. But really, it was the environment. The last cavern dive that we did, we went into Devil's Ear, and just up to the beginning of the goal line, at that moment, there were two divers coming out on DPVs with their lights from the darkness behind them. And it was like, I want to go where they just came from. And it just grabbed me. I had to be back there at some point.
Yeah, it is quite amazing. I was very similar. For me, it was exactly what you said. It was the skill set. And I think you're right. I mean, there are some great wreck divers and some great decompression open water divers out there. But the emphasis on trim, balance, buoyancy control, finning technique, etc., that you get from cave training really is not found anywhere else, in my opinion. There's just not the same emphasis on it, is there?
Right. In the training program that's available for overhead environment for the caves, there's nothing else like it. Yeah, there's an advanced rec course available, but I don't believe that the involvement and the scope of that course goes in as deep as a good cave course does. And just the fact that you're looking at a minimum of 8 days from beginning to end, not including decompression training, and the skills that you get hammered into you, even if you never cave dive again, just to go through that training will make you a much better diver.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I kind of feel it's one of the tenets that I kind of dive by too. I really wish this wasn't, especially in wreck diving, because it's a similar overhead environment. You face the similar issues with silting and and so on in a wreck. I mean, in some ways, wrecks can be even more challenging than caves because of the narrowness of almost all of the passage that you're in. You can get into big spaces, but you're very, very often going through small spaces. And just having that same skill level in wreck diving would be really beneficial. And I believe the tenet as well that cave divers shouldn't really go off and think they can dive wrecks, nor should wreck divers believe they can dive caves. But if you take a cave foundation set and then go and do some additional wreck training, I think you're going to be a really good wreck diver at the end of that.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Cave diving, if you look at it, if you're trained and experienced in cave diving and wreck diving, cave diving is easy. You pull up to the dive site, you grab your gear out of your truck or your van, walk it to the water. No boat schedules. It's on your own time. You know which way the current's going if there's current in there. And the depth, there's a ceiling, a physical ceiling that'll keep you from popping up too far. There's no sharks in there. I mean, it is much safer than wreck diving.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. And of course, you don't get blown off, as you said before as well, weather conditions. I mean, you don't want to go in a cave in a hurricane, I guess, but, it can be raining, it can be windy. It doesn't really matter too much, does it?
No, not at all.
So we talked about Sidemount and what drew you into that, but then you became a Sidemount instructor and a cave instructor. How did you sort of progress from that beginning of being a diver then to coming through and having it be what you do for your profession?
I was already teaching out in Arizona. We're quite active out there on the recreational side. Came out to Florida, and first thing I decided was I'm not going to teach for the first year because I just want to build up my experience cave diving as a resident cave diver versus a tourist cave diver. Learn the caves here and just become more proficient at it. And after about a year of doing that, I decided, this is something that I would enjoy teaching, and started along those lines. And at that time, I was already diving Sidemount. When I was in Arizona, I'd heard about Sidemount on the couple of Florida trips that we had made. I had seen some Sidemount divers about, not many. This was back mid 2000s, and there just weren't as many back then. But I took a harness and wing that I had and tried to make a haphazard Sidemount rig for out in Arizona to try. It dove good. It felt good. It wasn't streamlined at all. I didn't cinch down the sides of the wings or anything, but it was a good experience. I thought, okay, this is something that I would really enjoy. And I ended up buying my first Sidemount rig, which was a Dive Right Nomad at the time, because at that time we had two choices, Dive Right Nomad or Armadillo, and Armadillo just wasn't, you didn't see it around. You really didn't, it wasn't pushed and marketed as much as the Dive Right rig. So, I was diving that, getting more proficient in Sidemount during that first year in Florida as well. And that's when I decided, all right, let me go ahead and start on the internships, and that'll take me a year or so. And by that point, I'll have a few hundred dives and be more comfortable teaching this to someone. And it just kind of kept going from there. What led me to go more and more into Sidemount was, at the time also, there weren't any Sidemount classes. One agency had a Sidemount class that was more geared toward cave diving and advanced Sidemount, no mount type of diving. They're the only ones that had a book, a student manual. And again, it was not very comprehensive. It was not about how to set up your gear, how to get into Sidemount, but more focused on how you do advanced cave Sidemount techniques. And so I kind of had to trip through learning Sidemount on my own and tweaking and constantly trying to fix things. At the time, Sidemount divers were slinging stage tanks underneath them, just like in back mount, and completely throwing off the streamlining and trim of having a Sidemount rig. And so it was a matter of, at that point, starting to look for techniques and carrying the stage that fell more in line with the streamline feature of Sidemount diving. In fact, even when I went and did my internship to become a Sidemount instructor, again, there was one agency. I had to search around to find ITs that could even do that, and ended up with an IT who didn't even really dive Sidemount. But the only one that was within a 4-hour drive of where I was that do this. So it just wasn't something that was available back then.
Yeah. What era are we talking about here? Roughly what year?
We're talking roughly 2008, 2009. So, I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
just over 10 years ago, but Sidemount has come a long way in those 10 years.
Sure, yeah. I had a similar, not the same experience because I never went through the process of setting myself up and trying to do it myself. I did have a play. I sort of laugh about this one. When I did my dive master course, my instructor, he'd done some cave training and had designed his own side mount rig. And I had to play with that in the swimming pool, nearly drowned myself trying to sling a cylinder. First time I ended up completely inverted and it was hilarious. But it was pretty cool. I mean, when I put it on, I thought, yeah, I can see where this is going. I can tell it's wrong, but I can feel this is going to be awesome for me. But then I started doing some research on the internet. And it's one thing, like in New Zealand here, we're so far from anything. I mean, at that point, I think there might have been this guy, Matt, and me were the only people who even were aware of Sidemount in this country. And that would have been similar time, probably a year later, maybe 2010. But I know there's like Steve Bogarts and obviously the CDG guys were around for ages. And there were several in Florida, Lamar Hires, I guess, and others who had been doing it. But were you able to sort of look around at a bit of what was going on around the world as you were developing your own feel for it?
Yeah, in the beginning, a lot of it was Florida focused because that's where I
Hmm.
live. That's the people that I got to see. You mentioned like Lamar Hires and all that, but even seeing Lamar Hires out at the dive sites back then, he was in a rebreather. Woody Jasper wasn't really diving anymore at the time. He maybe out occasionally doing dives, but not very often. So 2008, 2009, it was rare to see someone diving side mount at the dive sites.
Yeah, so it's almost like some of the knowledge was lost, from Woody Jasper and those guys who started out, way, way back. And then all of a sudden they've moved on to rebreathers. And now this open circuit side mount part's been lost.
Exactly, exactly. And the stuff that they were doing it for these big exploration
Mm,
pushes. They kind of started doing it out of necessity. People that dove with them got to gain from their experience and knowledge, but
mhm.
just wasn't put out there as a general knowledge for people to take from.
Yeah, I get it.
At that time, it was you had to do a lot of the things on your own because there just weren't any resources out there.
So how did you progress through that period? So obviously you had a lot of time where you're figuring things out for yourself and iterating around, and I'm assuming you're taking steps forward and everything's improving as you go. So when did you get to that point, and what were you doing when you said, hey, yes, I've now got this dialed in and I'm feeling really good inside mount now?
A lot of diving. I was out
Mhm.
there several days a week doing the dives. I got to the point where I felt comfortable enough going into a cave in the configuration and starting to do
Mhm.
bigger dives. And then every dive, I would just tweak with something to make it fit a little bit more. I'd look at issues that I thought could cause problems, especially in the overhead environment, and make some changes. Some of them I liked, some of them I didn't.
Mhm.
It's a matter of little by little, and it took several years, probably a good 5 years or so, before I finally got to the point where it's like, yeah, I'm probably not done making changes, but I'm at least happy with what I have. And the changes that I make will just be small ones here and there as improvements keep coming up.
Yeah.
Uh, and even over the past few years, I've still made some changes into the rigs that I dive and added some things here and there just because side mount's still evolving
Yeah.
and things come up and a lot of them are worth trying.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, you only know what you know sometimes. I mean, I did my training in Mexico, so there's kind of Mexico style and Florida style, and there is a little bit of a European style around as well, and a few others. But it is interesting. You only know what you know, and I was sort of trained very much in that, and very happy with it for a while until I was living in California. Went back to Monterey and tried to dive steel cylinders, and that was a bit of a rude awakening for me. And then, like you, I had like 2 years or so of trying to figure this stuff out, and how's this going to work for me, and how do I dive a dry suit steels? And we're so much better served now, aren't we, with all the information available? I think the standard is improving. There's instructors out there who know what they're doing now. And of course, there's resources, which brings me on to the book. Your book here, Sidemount Diving, the Almost Comprehensive Guide. I love that title. Tell us a bit about the book and how it came about.
Well, like I said, back then there just weren't many resources. We had the one agency student manual, which was very bare bones and more
Hmm.
focused on diving in the cave environment and applying side mount to cave diving. There was Jill Heinerth's side mount book. She had come out with that a
Hmm.
couple of years before my first edition. And basically, her book described side mount, provided some information about it, but it didn't go into a lot of detail. It wasn't really as much of an instructional book as it was this is Sidemount.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that there just had to be something more out there, something more that you can give to students before class and say, read this, come to class prepared, and then expand from that once in class. And so basically, I was writing my own instructional manual for my students and just to put it out there for everyone else. So that was how that book, the first edition, came out back in 2015.
Yeah.
And of
Yeah,
course, the almost comprehensive, because like I said, Sidemount is still evolving. And in fact, the first edition's kind of been outdated for it's only 5 years old, but it's been outdated for a few years because so much has happened in the past 5 years.
Yeah, I understand completely. It's also part of my academic background when I did my business degree was knowledge management. And it's one of those things. I mean, you're absolutely right, almost comprehensive. This book is incredibly comprehensive. And yet, when you say, hey, tell someone, hey, write down everything you know about sidemount diving, which I'm assuming this book almost is. And then I ask you a question, and you go, oh, yeah, there is one more thing. So there's always something else. There's always another perspective or another way of looking at things, not to mention the fact that, yes, things are evolving, things are changing, we're learning more. And as I said earlier, I think one thing we are learning is that there are different ways to do this. Different parts of the world dive slightly different ways. Often it's driven by the environments they're diving, whether it's warm water, cold water, whether it's inside an overhead environment or open water or whatever. So there is a lot to this. And since I've been doing Speaking Sidemount, one thing that's happened to me is it's opened my eyes to all of these other ways that you can do things. And again, back to the book, one of the things I loved is that you've addressed a lot of that. You've basically acknowledged the fact that there's a lot of different cylinder types out there. There's a lot of different ways to mount cylinders. There's a lot of different harnesses, a lot of different ways to fit them, even the bungee types, etc. So it is a super interesting field now from that point of view. It's not like backmount. Backmount couldn't have a book almost like this, could it?
Yeah, with Sidemount, there is no standard, and there never will be, because it is different. When I first started diving in Cozumel, back in 2011, I was just taking my armadillo down there and using that with aluminum. And I did that for probably about 2.5, 3 years before I decided, there's got to be a better way. There were restrictions I was going through. I'd have to remove both tanks and push them out in front of me to get through. Well, when I switched over to a system that was more appropriate for aluminum tanks and wearing a wetsuit and those environments, basically a harness and a small wing, all of a sudden restrictions that required me to pull both tanks off and push them through in my armadillo, I could get through without removing either tank.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just you have to adapt to the environment that you're going to be diving in to get the most out of that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what that really says is you became so much more streamlined based on the equipment configuration you put on. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For steel tanks, I believe that having the air cells spread out a little bit more, having the air cells on each side of you rather than across your back, makes for a more stable and more effective wing. It provides for a better lift of the heavier steel tanks. Whereas for aluminum tanks, you don't need as much lift. You can have it centered over your back rather than spread out. And so there's a big difference between those two.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, again, the book, because one of the things I really appreciated was the way that you laid the book out. And it would have been one of the challenges, I'm sure, as you were putting it together is, in what order do I structure this? I mean, you start out with equipment, go through cylinders, you go through regulators, you go through the harness, and then you start to talk about something very dear to my heart, which is talking about trimming divers out and the work that you need to do out of the water before you get in, and then the work that you do in the water. Let's just go through that part first before we go on any further. So how did you figure out that structure? And then let's talk about the trim part as well. Let's talk about some of the things that are most important and what people might get from the book when they read it on that subject.
Basically, I just organized the book the way I organize my classes. And in the book, I also try to keep the voice of the book as if we were standing there in class and I'm telling you about it. So I try to have a very conversational tone on it rather than a textbook type of tone. And just, after years of teaching Sidemount, this is how I did it. The first day of Sidemount class was always, the entire day spent talking about gear, making modifications, making it work for the students, finding out what kind of diving they wanted to do so that we can make adjustments to their rigs for that style of diving. And the whole day was spent basically going through those first few chapters of the book up to and including the trimming out before even getting in the water. And then if we had time, we would get in a quick dive in the afternoon before we broke for the day. Usually we didn't have time. We'd just get in the water the next day and start off with that part of the book.
Yeah, interesting. And it is so important. I mean, it is one of the different things about Sidemount is number one, that, yeah, it's a bit fiddly, but the reason it's a bit fiddly is it needs to be fitted to the body shape and stature of the person. And as you say, the type of diving. I read something by Roger Williams the other day about him lamenting about being 6'6" and trying to find systems that work for him. It really is a thing. I've taught a lot of very tall people. I've taught a lot of very short people, some round people, and it does make a difference every single time you face a different body type, is making sure that you're starting with the cylinders and the harness and making sure that those two things are working together and they're in the right place on their body.
Yeah, there's no such thing as getting a side mount system, pulling it out of the bag and getting in the water with it. You need to make some changes to it, some adjustments, modifications, something so that it works for your body type. And that can take some time to do.
Yeah, and hence the first day of the course is focused on that. And I think by doing that, it sets you up for success on day two, doesn't it? Because now you've got someone in really good shape. And from our point of view as instructors, we want them to have a good experience that first time in the water, don't we?
Right. If they get in the water and they feel completely out of trim, they feel off balance, they're not going to like side mount. But we get in the water, that first dive, we get in the water after making all the adjustments. It takes no more than 5 minutes per person to get their tanks adjusted so that they're hanging off of the rig correctly and that they feel good. And after that, yeah, they love it. They love having the tanks at their sides rather than on their back because it stabilizes them. When you have the tank on your back, higher up around your shoulders, you have to work a little bit or a lot to stay in trim and in balance. But if you have a system adjusted properly, there is no work to it. If you completely relax, you should be perfectly horizontal and just be able to stay like that without moving your fins or your hands or anything.
Yeah. Many good things come from that, don't they? I mean, number one, I've talked to a lot of people about it. When you think about great diving, it's one of the keys to that is being relaxed and calm. And so having a system that supports that as opposed to fights you as the diver is really important. And of course, you get great gas consumption. You get the ability to increase your awareness because you're not fighting your equipment. And of course, from my point of view, it becomes more enjoyable.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so as we go on from that, you then start to talk about taking Sidemount into different environments. So let's talk a little bit about the differences between sort of open water Sidemount diving, cave diving, wreck diving, whatever. What do you need to consider when you're taking your Sidemount rig from one environment to another?
The first thing you need to consider is what type of cylinders are you going to be able to get wherever you're going, whether they're steel tanks or aluminum tanks. So we already touched on that part. The next thing is, all right, if you're going to be taking it onto a boat, are you proficient enough to do that? One of the things about Sidemount, it has a bad reputation among some circles because we have a lot of people that they go through their Sidemount course with mediocre or not even quite to that level instructors that just kind of throw the tanks on rigs that are pulled out of the bag without any adjustments, and they think they can side mount dive, but it takes them half an hour, 45 minutes just to get everything clipped on and ready to dive. And then they get on a boat and hold everything up. I mentioned in my book, make sure you are extremely proficient in getting your gear on and getting it off before you ever take it on a boat, because you do that, you're just going to piss a lot of people off if you don't have the proficiency in it. You need to be as quick as everyone else to be able to get in and out and keep your gear in your tight square space on that boat and not rely on everyone else. I've been diving all over the world off of boats and side mounts, usually on recreational boats. I just do single tank side mounts, but I've had no issues with it because I can gear up, I can get in the water, I can get back out without any assistance. And every boat captain that I've been with is very pleased with it, but
Mm.
they all always talk about, yeah, I had Sidemount divers on here last month and they were just horrible. They took so
Mm.
long. They just didn't seem to know what they were doing.
Yeah, yeah. And also there's damage to the boat too, especially with fiberglass boats, right? They're very sensitive to that. And so if you're banging cylinders around getting in and out of the water, that particularly is a sensitive issue for them. You're absolutely right. I mean, and the trouble I think that you have sometimes, for instance, if you do your course in cave country and you're, as we said before, you walk down a nice set of steps and you're in a platform and you can stand in waist deep water and put your cylinders on and then go away and happily dive. It's quite a different proposition on a boat. So having different techniques for different conditions as well, knowing how to be able to don them on the boat, knowing how to, if the conditions allow, to don in the water. And you do have to ask the boat crew to pass cylinders in and out for that. But again, that's taken care of with a tip at the end of the dive. And provided you're not holding anybody up, I've never found anyone minding doing that. But sometimes there's current, sometimes there's waves, sometimes the boat requires you to put your cylinders on. And as you say, they're set up for back mount. So they're set up with little small spaces. And I even find this with my rebreather. People like to, what we say, take the piss out of me with the Sidewinder because it's wider and it's not designed to stand up. So I have to be able to lay it down on a boat. And so I have to sort of say, hey, can I have that space there to lay it down? I won't need very much space anywhere else, but that's what you need, right? And so you do have to be mindful and realize that boats are designed primarily for back mount setups and we're a bit wider. And so then how do you deal with that? And having a toolkit of skills and the experience in doing that is really useful. And just for the listeners, there are some great materials out there on that. In addition to, again, Rob's addressed it in his book, but Misha pointing back to his videos. I don't know if you've seen those, Rob, of various ways of getting in the water from a boat, which I thought was excellent. Steve Martin, I think, has also done some. So having that dialed in before you go there is absolutely essential. You mentioned cylinders as well. I mean, sometimes you get to choose steel or aluminum, but often you don't, right? Especially going to the tropics. It's aluminum or nothing, right? And of course, then you don't have modular valves. Either you're dealing with two left or two right-hand valves. So how do you advise people deal with that when you're coming in, you've been diving steels, now you've got aluminiums and they're not modular. So you've basically got two lefts or two rights. How do you advise people to deal with that?
First thing is, before you ever leave home, practice at home. Get some cylinders and play around with them. If you're going and if you know where you're going, you're only going to be able to get aluminum cylinders with the same valves on them, not opposing valves. Take some time to practice it at home, rigging it up, setting it up so that you're not wasting a day wherever you've traveled to just trying to get everything configured and set up. In Cozumel, that's pretty much all that's available. There are aluminum cylinders with same facing valves. So I prefer to have the hand wheel facing out so that I can access it much more easily. So one valve faces up, one valve faces down. There's no way around that. So practice that and be aware of how it may affect your diving and how it may affect the way you do things. Typically, I like to have my valves facing up so that the first stage is in my armpits and better protected. Especially going through smaller restrictions, that keeps it from being able to touch the bottom of the cave and just offers it added protection. Well, on my right cylinder, that's not an option when I don't have opposing valves. So I need to be aware of that and make sure that that valve, if I'm going through a restriction, is better protected and doesn't receive any damage from going through that restriction.
Have you had a go? Because I do that differently. So I basically had the same thought process around that, which was when that happens, how am I going to do it? Do I want to have them both in, which I normally dive the same as you, or do I want to have one out? So the issue, as you said, is access to that valve hand wheel with your right hand. I made the decision to basically have both first stages into my armpits, and then I wrap my loop bungee around the actual valve hand wheel. What it means, the valve hand wheel's to the left. So now I'm pretty much as I'm used to diving, but now if I want to shut that cylinder down, it's pretty much a left-hand action. I can do it with my right reaching across a little, but I just use my left hand for it. So it's two left-hand actions. Of course, if your left hand's out of action, that can be a problem, but I guess it's a judgment call each way. And so did you have a go at that? And what were your thoughts on that?
I thought about it, and the reason I chose to keep both valves out is for that reason that you said, if you're in a restriction, I may not be able to reach across with my left hand or reach around with my right hand. So I may not be able to do a thing with that valve in the restriction.
Mm-hmm.
And there are places in Cozumel, some of the passages I've been through, where I'm in a restriction that's pretty low for a good 10, 20 meters.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking about that is like, I'd rather have access to the valve and just be a little bit more aware of
Sure.
that stage and making sure that it doesn't get damaged than have that valve turned in where it's not so easy for me to get to. Diving open water, different story. Open water or wrecks, different story, because it's probably not going to happen where you find yourself in a low passage where you can't bring your arm across to reach that valve. So it depends on the environment that you're diving.
Yeah, understood. It's an interesting, that's just one point. Whenever you're looking at different facets of side mount, there's often many ways you can go. And so long as I think you think it through, Ed Sorensen has a saying, the why behind the how. Here's how you do it, but why are you doing it that way? And provided you have a good reason, then fine. And provided it's not unsafe, of course. But it's the same with the classic lollipopping your SPGs. Like many people think, you're going to die if you do it that way. Well, of course not. There's a reason to do it that way. But provided you're sound and the reason that you dive accordingly, then that's fine. I mean, I don't do it that way. I have mine back if I'm using them, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong the other way. You just need to be aware of how you're diving and what it means for you.
Right. Yeah, I used to, speaking of lollipopping, I used to do that when I first started out with Sidemount. For me, it really, with the first stages up in the armpits, the SPG was right up against my shoulder. So it really wasn't an issue. But there, you see a lot of people in Florida that do lollipop, but their SPG faces are down several centimeters below them, either because they have their first stages facing forward, and so the angle of the HP ports, or the bottoms of their tanks have raised up, and so now the SPGs are down. And in that case, that's something that you do need to be aware of, and maybe make some adjustments so that that doesn't happen. When I started running my SPGs down along the tank, was, again, it came back to the not having opposing valves and having to have one first stage. The decision I made to have that one first stage facing forward, it just didn't make sense to have that SPG pointing up, lollipopping, because it was getting in the way, and putting it down along the body of the cylinder made more sense and made it more streamlined and kept it protected more.
Yeah. And there's some overarching principles in there too, I think, which is basically comes all down to streamlining. I was having a conversation with some divers yesterday about that. This is back mount versus side mount almost. And in my mind, one of the underlying tenets of side mount is streamlining. And I make the saying a lot, if you're going to be in the water, why would you not be streamlined? It's almost nonsensical that you would do anything against streamlining. And so you would take every step possible to streamline yourself. And the point we were making is when you make a fin kick and you're completely streamlined, a gentle kick will move you a long way. The hydrodynamic physics are such that it takes a lot more energy the less streamlined you are. So yeah, I've seen people overcome that with scooters, but again, that's just nonsensical to me. It's why would you not want to be like a shark or a marine mammal? The apex predators are incredibly streamlined for a reason, because they're moving in water and they need to be able to do it efficiently. So we should do the same. So that comes back to number one, your profile, and number two, do you have lots of dangles, bits and pieces, which affect streamlining, and of course are also entanglement hazards.
Exactly. And even with scooters, I mean, if you're not streamlined, you're going to put more strain on the motor, which is going to pull more power from the battery, and you're actually going to shorten your runtime on that scooter.
Yeah.
Even with scooters, you're not really overcoming anything. You're using a tool, but you're limiting that tool now because you're still not streamlined.
Mm. All right, just a couple of things on the book as well. I know how tough it is to write one. I mean, what made you do it in the first place? What made you sort of commit, literally, I'm sure it's months, if not years of your life, to putting a book out like this?
Like I said, there was nothing like it at the time. I don't think there still is anything like it right now. And it was more, I saw a need, and took several years. I started jotting down notes when I started teaching Sidemount. I started building it, and then I got kind of more involved with teaching, and that project went to the side. And then I thought, you know what? I need to really pick this back up because it'll help me. And picked it back up, and it kind of went back and forth like that for a few years. So I finally said, okay, I need to do this. I need to get this project finished and get it out there. And one of the things that took the longest was actually getting the pictures that I needed for that.
Yeah. And I saw Laurent Moreau done a lot of the images in there. They're just amazing.
Yeah, the action shots. Fortunate enough to have him as a student and as a close friend and be able to use his images because they are truly amazing. Those images were easy to get. The images that I'm talking about were more the illustrative images in the chapters on what this looks like, what that looks like, both bad and good, because you need to be able to show both sides of it. So finally got all that together. And then recently with this pandemic and everything kind of slowing down. I'm like, you know what? I've been thinking about releasing a second edition. The 5-year anniversary is coming up. This is the time to do it. So I sat down and just started working on it. Yeah, it took a few months, several hours a day. And
yeah, I saw a bit of comment online about the price of it. And a couple of things is I've written a book myself that's on Amazon, and I don't know that people actually realize a couple of things. Number one, the volume of work that goes into creating something like this is immense, isn't it?
It really is. But the pricing on it, I didn't want to price it that much for when you have a 300-page book. And Amazon, Jeff Bezos wants his part of the pie, and his part is very large. The printing costs of the book are probably account for about a third of that.
Yep.
And the distribution parts that Amazon takes is an even bigger chunk. So after all said and done, I don't really get that much of that. I get less than a third of that final list price.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, even with the Kindle version, they charge the same. Amazon charges the same or takes the same amount, whether it's print or Kindle. So they don't say, well, we didn't have to print a book out, so we're not going to charge you printing costs. They still charge that. And so you still get the same whether you sell a print or a Kindle version of the book.
Yeah. I wanted to just have the chance to discuss that because I was very aware of that. And I don't think a lot of people are. So yeah, when you choose the publishing on demand route, and there's a lot of advantages to that from the point of view of not dealing with publishers and so on. But the downside is that there is a lot of the printing costs, number one, the margin that Amazon takes, number two, and then, of course, shipping costs around the world are in there as well. So as the author, you really don't get the share that I think people are seeing it. And now that I've had a really good look through the book as well, in terms of the value that it's delivering for a Sidemount diver, I think it's a small amount of money to pay for what's coming your way when you get a copy of this. So just from me, highly recommended, not only from the point of view of how comprehensive it is, but the value of the content. I mean, it's taken you, I'm sure, 10, 20 years of your life also to build the experience to even know how to write what's in there as well.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I do when I sell the book personally and I ship it out personally, I do sell it for $50. I can't advertise it like that because Amazon doesn't allow that. But I do have special deals. Like I just had a Cyber Monday deal where it was back on $50. I'll even create a deal to go with your podcast when you air this.
So that's awesome. Let's do that.
The issue with that, if there's international shipping, there's still international shipping fees, but I'm looking at workarounds for that to try to reduce the cost of the shipping. But I can create a coupon code and I'll send that to you so we can put out
let's do that.
Special deal for the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. One thing you may or may not be aware, but I wrote my own manual as well, which is very, very similar in concept to yours, except very, very discreet to just my course and just the way that I teach. So there's nothing really very much outside of that. But I did it for exactly the same reason. Funnily enough, in about the same time frame, it was 2015, 16, when I was in Gozo. And the reason that I did that was that I was very unhappy with the agency manuals that were available. I just thought they were very general. They didn't really teach you anything that supported the course. Gave you some good background in Sidemount diving, but a little bit of internet research, and you'd get that anyhow. So I wanted something that my students could read that would say, hey, step by step, here's how you do it. And it's not even a quarter of what you've got there for sure, but the same reason. So when I went into this, I thought, yeah, I can see what you're doing. You've looked at it in so much more detail, lots of different perspectives and lots of different ways of Sidemount diving too. So I think if you're a Sidemount diver, I'd highly recommend you get a copy of this. That's for sure. It's just in closing on the book, I mean, what do you hope your readers get from the book?
I just hope that they can get some information to help them get set up in Sidemount. There are instructors out there like you and several other instructors around the world that do offer good Sidemount courses. And if they have access to someone like you, then they should definitely take advantage of that. But there are a lot of divers out there that don't have access to good side mount instructors. There are a lot that are located in places where they just aren't there and they can't afford to travel. So I'm hoping that they can take this book and look at it and maybe create a side mount journey for themselves that at least gets them looking decent in the water and enjoying it and not flailing all about trying to figure out why are we not in balance.
Yeah. And I mean, along with the book, there's a lot of video resource out there now on YouTube and so on, where you can see good side mount diving in action. I remember I used to watch the DRSS guys a lot. This is Philip Lehman and Petra Widman, those guys. And what got me about them was just how amazing they were in the water, you know, relaxed and just very slow. And everything about it got me. And I just watched them and I'd sort of slow it down and freeze it and see if I could see what they were doing. And, you know, it's great that we can do that now, but it still doesn't give you the full picture. There's nothing beats instruction, of course, good instruction, that is. But as I said, this is a great book to have no matter what. So let's move on a bit. I know you've been involved in a bunch of cave exploration projects. You mentioned Cozumel and some of the restrictions and so on there. Tell us a bit about that project and all the projects there, how you got involved and what you were looking to achieve.
So back in 2011, I saw an opportunity to go down to Cozumel on one of Mike Young's trips, put it out there, and I reached out. I'd gone to the mainland a couple of times and we wanted to go back to Mexico, but at that time the crime rates were increasing. I think that's around the time Mayan Blue got shut down because of an assault there. So we're like, well, that's not going to happen. Then we saw this opportunity for Cozumel, jumped on it, came out, did a few dives in Cozumel and just fell in love with the caves there. A few months later, we set up another trip, came out. We were doing a little bit more exploration. And from there, it just kind of blew up. You know, I was diving this one cave that I initially dived on that first trip. On a subsequent trip, I came out, talked to Herman Yanez, who's the cave diver on the island. He had asked for some gold line for some of the caves down there. And I grabbed some and brought it down and helped him lay it out. And in doing so, I realized, hey, you know, this cave is rather close to the other cave we've been exploring. There's got to be a connection there somehow. So I started looking for that. It took a good 2-3 years. I think it was 2014 is when I finally found the connection between the two caves. And I'll tell you, by that point, I had already switched over from the Armadillo to my Mexico side mount rig. It's a Razor style, but it uses a different wing, and I'm actually using Andy Gore's side mount and some of his other hardware. The connection to it is in that side mount rig is a 210 push through probably a good 7-8 meters long restriction to get through between the two. I've been through it a couple of times and that's it. I mean, it's a pretty hairy connection, but I made that connection. And then I just decided I want to map this system because all the data from it was like 30 years old. So I resurveying, which meant replacing a lot of the line because 30-year-old line in saltwater doesn't last very long. A lot of broken or fragile lines, started replacing it, resurveying this system, which is called Cueva Quebrada, which was 29,000 feet or about 9,000 meters in line passage as of the map that they finished back in the 1990s. Since then, with the exploration that we've done down there, we've gotten it to close to 85,000 feet. So probably about 27,000 meters. One section that I found back in 2016 alone has more line passage than the original cave map showed on the entire system.
Wow.
For a while there, I'd go back and we'd be pushing and then we'd kind of stop finding leads. And I thought, okay, you know, maybe another trip or two and I'll be done down here. I've stopped thinking that. Every time I go back, I find more. And there's a whole section of that cave that I haven't even gone into to look at. I know there's a lot more exploration that I'll actually end up having to pass on to someone else.
Yeah, all my conversations with Brian Kaycock about the Bahamas are exactly the same. You know, there's more cave there than he could ever hope to achieve in several lifetimes.
Yeah.
Hey, you mentioned going out with Mike Young the first time. I mean, the transition from being an instructor to an explorer, I mean, they're two very different things. As I spoke to Victor Tovar about a couple of episodes back, you know, just because you're a cave instructor doesn't mean you're an explorer. It's a different mindset. It's a different task. And there's many different skills that need to be applied, including mapping and surveying. Talk a little bit about how you went from this cave instructor to then starting to do exploration projects.
Well, I was always interested. Part of the allure of cave diving was the unknown
Mm-hmm.
and going and exploring things, even if it was line passages, just seeing
Mm-hmm.
new passages, new sites. But of course, with that being the allure to cave diving, I also wanted to find virgin passage.
Mm-hmm.
In Florida, I'd poked around, found some small stuff here and there, but nothing real major for the longest time. And with the trip to Cozumel, that offered me my first real opportunity to find some passage that was not explored because it's not one of the cave diving destinations that most
Mm-hmm.
people go to just because of the logistics, because they're not set up for cave divers. It's renting tanks on the island is not something that's easy to do unless you're going through a dive shop or you make connections. And then it's not the park and dive type of diving that you find or on the mainland in Mexico, most of the mainland in Mexico. We're at a point now where we actually hire local Sherpas to carry our gear through the jungle just to get to the cenotes that we're going to. So yeah, it's a different mindset with exploration. The rule of thirds still applies, but there's a lot of recalculations because you may go down a path and it doesn't really end up going anywhere. So you end up come back and you assess, recalculate. At that point, you don't want to just turn around if you've got gas that you can use to explore. Still have the rules that you have to abide by, but you're basically looking out for yourself. A lot of it is solo diving because you're going to split up with the other explorers on the team and go and do your own thing. It is a different mindset, and the rewards, they're different, but they're just as satisfying, whether you're teaching or you're exploring.
Mm. Yeah, probably in my lifetime, not something that I'll get to do, but certainly I can imagine the appeal from a younger diver's point of view, younger cave divers, and not that age necessarily any barrier, it's just opportunity. And also, I think you have to acknowledge what you want to do in diving too, as well. And as you mentioned, if it's not exploration, it's discovery when you're going down a new passage, whether it's lined or not. And there's a lot to get from that. But I am very, enamored by the process of starting and what you need to learn. And I'm starting to see you mentioned, as you said, going with Mike, I've seen Robbie Schmidt is running a project in Mexico for an all-female team where he's supporting them to get started in cave exploration, which I think is great. They're all amazing divers. Some of them have done a little bit of it, but being involved in a project under the mentorship of someone who has been doing it for many, many years, I think is awesome. Toddy's doing some of that too.
Yeah, it helps a lot because the logistics of setting something up like this, they can be overwhelming for someone who hasn't done it. It helps to have someone who knows the systems well. Being that I've surveyed pretty much every inch of cave in Cozumel, or almost every inch of cave in Cozumel, I know those systems like I know the roads around my house. I can get in there and know exactly where to go, even if I pass 15 or 20 T's on the line. And that knowledge, in my opinion, that's something that's really important for exploration. You need to know the cave because the only way you're going to find that big mother lode of virgin passage is by knowing the cave and knowing which direction there is no mapped cave. That's one of the things that I've always done is, I go in, I'll find virgin passage, I'll lay line, but, I always turn with enough gas that I know I can survey everything that I put in on that dive because what I want to do is come out that afternoon, I go back to the house, I plot the data that I got. That way, the next day I know this is where I want to focus my efforts on exploration. And not just go in haphazardly and hope I find a hole that goes somewhere, but go with the focus of where to look. It's resulted in over 10,000 meters of virgin passage being lined down there. Florida, I've got a few projects in which there's this one cave that I've been exploring that went from about 500 meters of line to probably about 3,000 meters of line in a few months of exploration in it. And simply because no one ever bothered to poke around. They thought, all right, it was found years ago or decades ago, it's pushed out completely, and they just don't think that it's going to give anything up. But I don't have that attitude. If I go in a cave, my attitude is there's going to be something that someone missed.
I hear that so much. Ryan Kachkowski in Australia, same thing. He was able to connect part of Tank into Fossil Cave. Christina Zanato in Bahamas, she said the same thing. She's exploring cave that I think Rob Palmer originally did. And then she found tons of new passage there where everyone thought it was tapped out. And as you say, I mean, you've just got to know where to look and think things through, and there's more to be found, no question.
And it's not all side mount size. I mean, the new section in Cozumel that I pushed, it was through a side mount restriction, but I looped back to the main cave over 1,000 meters in a loop. I'm just running line through a big passage that you can drive a big bus through.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden I see old brown line just sitting on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
So I go up, I tie on, and since I've surveyed the cave, I have an idea of where I am. I tied
Mm-hmm.
on, surveyed out, plotted the data, and I'm like, I saw where I was on the map, and I was incredulous as to where I was. The
Mm-hmm.
next time back the other way and came
Mm-hmm.
up in my white line, and where they ended their line, that passage, like I said, was large enough to drive a bus through. And I said, how
Wow.
did they go back and keep pushing there? There's no way to know what they were thinking. I think they got distracted by finding somewhere else and just never went back. And good for me, because 30 years later, I was able to dump a bunch of line back in that area.
It's amazing. And this is ongoing for you now?
Yes, it's still ongoing. I don't see any end in sight for this project.
Amazing. Well, Rob, look, it's been brilliant to catch up with you. Great to talk about your book and about your diving and the exploration projects, and also learn a bit more about the way that you see Sidemount and cave diving and how you got into it and so on. So thanks very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. We're going to get a discount code for the book, so I'll have all of that in the podcast notes. There'll also be links to Rob's business, Chipola Divers in Florida. And thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for sharing.
Well, thanks for having me, Steve. It was a pleasure being a part of this.
Thanks, mate. We'll catch you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Hey, well, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did making it. It was phenomenal to catch up with Rob Neto and learn more about his diving and about his motivations for writing his book, Sidemount Diving, the Almost Comprehensive Guide. I really enjoyed talking to Rob, and it was also great to learn a bit more about his exploration projects in Cozumel. Now, don't forget, there'll be a discount code for Rob's book in the podcast notes. And also, again, if you're a regular listener, I would really appreciate your support of the show through Patreon. Again, I'll put a link for that in the podcast notes. Thanks so much for listening. I hope regardless of where you are in the world, you're doing okay, and I'll look forward to catching you in the next episode of Speaking Sidemount. You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.